that they have in the 70s at sort of a Black Power moment in New York when they're both squatting in this house together. And in the book, in Malamud's view, I think it becomes very clear that everybody's authenticity is predicated on everybody else's. Or if, everybody's authenticity is predicated on everybody else's existence and subjectivity. And I think that, I don't really, all I know of Shapiro is the sentences you're reading me, but I really wonder about his investigations into this whole notion of blackness and authenticity, because I think that there's an extremely fraught and complex and ongoing history and discussion of what that means, what authenticity means, in the context of blackness. So it doesn't strike me. It strikes me as a little bit glib, I guess.
Do you think there's something to? I'm struggling how to phrase this. There seems to be like a much more eager need among certain Jews to be embraced by blacks than by blacks to be embraced by Jews. Do you sense that? See that?
Not necessarily. I mean, on one hand, yes, and I think that that the story there has to do with an awareness on the part of Jews. First of all, Jews as a subset of white people, people who are seen in the world predominantly as white and have the privileges endemic to that, right? I think what that has to do with is validation, which semantically divorces you from privilege and makes you not have to feel guilty. In other words, if black people accept you, then you don't have to really grapple with what it means to have all of these unearned, inherited, sort of privileges granted to you by society. I think that's been the dynamic, particularly of my generation, of the hip-hop generation, is this notion that this is what my book, Angry Black White Boy, is largely dealing with, is the notion that constant affirmation from black people is the best way to, and that extends to living in sort of a hip multicultural community, and all kinds of other things, is a way to divorce yourself from privilege rather than sort of confronting it and figuring out how it might be dismantled. So I think that need for affirmation is a subconscious or sometimes conscious awareness of privilege, which makes people feel uncomfortable, makes them feel like if they were to really look at it, it would force them to deal with things that are too complicated and too painful for them to really think about. The flip side of that is that I know, sort of being the guy that I am and moving in the communities I move in, I can't even tell you how many sort of like black Jewophiles I know. How many black friends I have who say, man, I wanted to be Jewish when I grew up, or my community was black and Jewish. I was so comfortable with these Jewish folks. I wanted to be around them. My friend Scott Polson Bryant, who's a writer, an essayist and a novelist who teaches at Brown right now, is one of these folks. Angela Woodson, who is somebody I do a lot of talks with, who works at the Ohio governor's office, is constantly talking about sort of her fond memories of Jews growing up, and I know plenty of black people who speak more Yiddish than I do. I think that there's it's not something that gets a whole lot of attention or is talked about publicly very often. But I think my experience has certainly been that there is a real reciprocal interest. It's totally anecdotal, of course, but that's what I've seen.
Okay, awesome. Anything that I should have asked you about your new book that I have not asked you?
Is there anything? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should ask you?
I mean, I don't know. Probably. It's always interesting to me because any time that I get talking to somebody ostensibly like about my book, particularly somebody smart and interesting like yourself, we always end up totally far afield, and it never ends up being like, so tell me about chapter 3, or, why do you use semicolons the way you do? It always becomes like a much broader sort of socio-cultural discussion, which I think is great. And in some ways, it's like, that's hopefully, it's like the work of the book is to get some of those conversations going. But, at times, it can be, it can be, sometimes I sort of yearn to actually talk about craft, or talk about, sentence structure, or talk about, the book itself in some kind of sustained way that doesn't sort of use it as a point of departure for a whole different conversation, as interesting as that conversation might be. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I hear you. And the first 3 chapters seemed quite different than the rest of the book. I'm wondering if I'm just totally out to lunch. But the first 3 chapters seem like very traditional commercial storytelling. I mean that in a positive sense. And then the rest of the book is much more complicated. Is there anything to that?
Complicated in what sense?
Well, the first introducing each protagonist, it seems linear. Like the story's going somewhere, and I'm forming expectations for how the story will go, and then the rest of the book explodes my expectations.
That's interesting. What expectations?
Well, the first, Tristan. I thought, this is going to be the story of the rise of a great Jewish novelist who came out of this background that was not really friendly to writing novels, and this is going to be about the rise of this novelist. Instead, the rest of the book is about his fall and somewhat climb back up, but I expected it to be about his rise, and then I expected Nina, this would be about her rise as a great photographer, but really it's about her struggles. And then the same with Tris. So, how traditional, like Harold Robbins. Ever read any Harold Robbins?
No, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, he's like the quintessential commercial novelist. I mean, his story is all about someone who's poor, who works hard, gets a lot of sex and success, and then fails, and then gets more sex and success.
Yeah.
And so I start the book and okay, this guy's poor and he's in a Jewish ghetto, and he's just starting to explore the outside world and starting to find his range his meter as a novelist. And then boom, when I encounter him again, it's not about his rise, it's about his struggle.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I certainly didn't set out to build up, in those first 2 chapters. I definitely didn't set out to create a set of expectations that I was then going to foil. I didn't intend any sort of misdirection. I guess I don't know. To me, I mean, those first 3 chapters are sort of the start points for each of these characters in some way. Moments that set them on a certain path. But I certainly tried to sort of anticipate in terms of character, in terms of gesture, that none of these folks was going to have an easy time of it. In a lot of ways, there's this in all 3 of those chapters. There's sort of this relationship between the artist and some kind of outside cultural force, and in all 3 cases, it's some element of black culture that sort of provides a spark, but also, I think, points toward a relationship that's going to be difficult. The primary relationships set up in all of those chapters, I hope anyway, are tense even from the beginning. Tristan and Pendergast, Tris and his grandfather,